Welcome to the State of the Earth podcast from the Graduate School of Environment and Sustainability at the University of Exeter. I'm Sophie, a postgraduate student studying Sustainable Business Management on the Environment pathway. I'm really looking forward to this conversation today with Dr. Laura Colombo, Senior Lecturer at the University of Exeter Business School. Laura's research explores critical pedagogies and socially driven enterprises that emphasize environmental sustainability, particularly those that function based on cooperative principles. Laura examines how these enterprises can transform the way people relate to nature, encouraging deeper connections and a sense of mutual respect. Laura is particularly interested in how social and cooperative enterprises can scale effectively, as well as the dynamics associated with alternative food networks. Additionally, Laura's work explores management education, focusing on civic management education that is rooted in the principles of human and ecological flourishing. Her research focuses on promoting educational practices that boost management skills, whilst also benefiting communities and the environment. So today we'll be focusing our discussion on the need to reconfigure management education and transform the business school. But before we dive into today's discussion, maybe you can share a little bit about your journey into management scholarship and your background.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sophie. And it's a pleasure to be part of this initiative. So my academic journey started in Italy, where I'm from. So I'm originally from a small rural village in northern Italy between Milan and the Alps, so near Como Lake. I went to university for my undergraduate degree in Milan. And I remember I was very unsure about what to do. I was very torn between philosophy, sociology, and political science. And in the end, I decided to study an interdisciplinary degree in political science with international relations. And this, perhaps paradoxically, led me to develop a strong interest in local, place-based social cooperation and issues of social and environmental justice. So then, after working in the third sector for a while, I moved to Bologna, to the center of Italy, and enrolled into a 2 years master's in social economy management. And there I learned a lot about cooperatives, social enterprises, and other forms of organizations that are called alternatives. So they are not centered around profit maximization, but profits are reinvested in the pursuit of social or environmental goals. And in that context, I found that discussions within social economics were, and still are in a way, heavily anthropocentric. So, we would talk about social value, social impact, social enterprise, and it felt like the natural environment was, in a way, the elephant in the room. So very present, but really not considered very much. So I wrote a dissertation titled Social Enterprise and the Environment, and then decided to continue studying to deepen my understanding of ecological perspectives within social economics. So, for example, ecological economics and the so-called post-growth organizing. So, in other words, approaches to business and management that were, firmly grounded in societal needs and highly aware of ecological systems and the planetary boundaries. So then I moved to the UK, to the University of Exeter, where I was supposed to stay for a month. But then life had other plans, so I've stayed, and here I am now, 10 years later, still in the southwest of England. I did a PhD at Exeter on the scaling strategies of social agricultural cooperatives, and then moved to the Penryn campus in 2021 to lead a new undergraduate program called Business and Environment.
Thank you so much for giving that background. It's really interesting to see how you've traveled through different topics and found yourself working on what you're working on today. So I guess moving on to today's topic of discussion, in your recent essay for the Academy of Management Learning and Education, you argue that management education needs a fundamental change to tackle today's grand challenges. So what do you see as the main issues with current management education, and where do these problems come from?
Yeah, so there is a vast scholarship that portrays contemporary and higher education in general and business schools in particular as unhealthy environments. So places in which students are customers, in which there is a culture of competition, or a curriculum heavily focused on for-profit enterprises, or an education system that remains highly elitist. But my essay begins by reflecting on 4 specific and mostly unintended dysfunctional consequences of contemporary management education. So I refer to previous research that demonstrates how management education, first of all, nourishes greedy behavior. So again, unintentionally, But there is a powerful paper by Wang and colleagues, which was published in 2011, that demonstrates how economics education in business schools is consistently associated with a positive perception of greed and a positive attitude towards greedy actions. And the second unintended dysfunctional consequence is that management education, contemporary management education, encourages an obsession with outputs, with key performance indicators, with rankings or with marks. And this obsession, so this instrumentality, leads to severe consequences on both students and staff mental health. And then the third dysfunctional consequence is that through teaching capitalism uncritically, contemporary management education exacerbates inequality. And finally, through upholding eco-illiteracy, management education unintentionally aggravates the ecological crisis. And in fact, it is rare to find in a business school curriculum issues such as the planetary boundaries or environmental justice or ecological thinking. So I looked at this, pretty depressing state of affairs through the theoretical lenses offered by a sociologist called Robert Merton, who suggests that dysfunctional consequences are precursors to change. So I'm quoting from his work. He says that when a social structure is clearly dysfunctional, there develops a strong pressure for change. And Merton suggests that dysfunctional consequences originate from specific behavior, which originates from specific beliefs or meanings that we ascribe to a situation. And he calls this cycle the self-fulfilling prophecy. So in searching for the root of the problem, we really need to focus on beliefs and meanings, that these are the origins of vicious cycles. And in the essay, I suggest that management education is based on 4 fundamental assumptions. So first of all is the idea that humans are self-interested by nature. So this is the so-called Homo economicus, which is based on Thomas Hobbes' ideas, that Homo homini lupus, that we are wolves to other humans. And then the second assumption is the idea that we only act if we can get something in return. So this is the idea of instrumental rationality. So students and staff are motivated by, say, earning more money or increasing our impact factor or getting a higher mark. And then the third assumption is that there is no alternative to business as usual. So that profit maximization and capital accumulation are normal or natural for businesses, and that putting them at the center is the only way to run a successful business. And then finally, the fourth assumption is that it's possible to decouple economic growth and social and environmental degradation. So the so-called mechanistic approach to management. So my point is that one of the key takeaways in the essay is that these 4 assumptions generate self-fulfilling prophecies. I'll just give you a couple of examples. So if we assume that humans are self-interested by nature, that results in teaching self-interest maximization, which encourages greedy behavior, which reinforces the very assumption that indeed we are self-interested. As another example, if you assume that management is a mechanistic discipline, so that environment, society, and business are cogs of a machine that can be pulled apart and studied, understood, and managed separately, well, that assumption results in the creation of disciplinary silos. And that results in business school graduates being, de facto eco-illiterate, which results in the businesses they lead exacerbating the ecological crisis.
So based on this, how do you suggest we change outdated beliefs to better address urgent and complex issues like climate and environmental crises? What alternative models or approaches do you envision for management education that could better serve both students and society?
So I think it's important to go back to Robert Merton and so to focus on the root of the problem and change the assumptions that initiate the vicious cycles, or what he says, the self-fulfilling prophecies. So I'll be more specific. What if we assume that humans are a highly cooperative species? Now, I'm not saying that we are cooperative all the time. Of course, we can be self-interested. We can be wolves to other humans. But we are also highly cooperative. We are capable to be. And there is plenty of research that demonstrates this. And this used to be the assumption of Antonio Genovesi, who was one of the leading scholars of civil economy in the 18th century. So Genovesi was given the first academic chair in political economy in Europe at the University of Naples. And it's interesting that when I ask students whether they heard about Thomas Hobbes, some of them have. But then when I asked them about Antonio Genovesi, is very rare. In fact, it's nearly impossible that anyone has heard about him. And it's interesting because his assumption was that homo homini natura amicus est, so that by nature, humans are friendly to other humans. And then what if we assume that we don't only act because we can get something in return, but sometimes, or perhaps often, we act because we believe in what we do, so because we are guided by our values. And then what if we assume that there are plenty of alternatives to business as usual? And, what we recognize that the for-profit enterprise has historically been built upon extractive, exploitative, colonial, and linear systems of production. And there is now a lot of research on the so-called alternative or post-growth organization that really highlights how there are plenty of alternative business models that can put social and environmental needs at the center. And then finally, what if we assume that organizations don't operate in a vacuum, but they are embedded in social ecological systems? Well, my suggestion is that changing these assumptions can enable or can set off positive, virtuous cycles. So moving away from a neoliberal and towards a civic management education. And there is research supporting this intuition. You might have heard of the Pygmalion effect, for example. That is Rosenthal and Jacobson, 1968. They discovered that expectations in the classroom do influence students' behavior. So assuming that the student is high achieving will encourage them to perform as best as they can. That's what their research was about. So if we can take the same logic, we could argue that, for example, assuming that humans are a highly cooperative species leads to expectations of reciprocity. And that encourages cooperation, which reinforces the assumption that we indeed can be highly cooperative. And I'll give you another example. If we assume that management is a systemic discipline, so that environment, society, and business are interdependent elements of a complex living system, well, that will result in designing teaching and research that is interdisciplinary, so that it requires collaboration between scholars from different disciplines, which means that business graduates will have a much better understanding of how complex systems work, and which means that they will be able to provide much more meaningful solutions to the social and ecological crises that we face today.
That's really interesting. It seems then to build a civic business school, we need to work more collaboratively with other disciplines. So how have you personally pursued this in your teaching here in Penryn and more widely in your research work?
Yes, absolutely. Interdisciplinarity is fundamental. I've been trying to build bridges between the business school and other departments ever since I first set foot in Penryn. For a start, the management department in Penryn is called Sustainable Futures, which immediately gives you an idea that we consider business as a means to achieve, higher aims, and that we are much more aware of the complexity of the challenges that we face today. So climate change, biodiversity loss, the cost of living crisis, and so on. So businesses affect and are affected by these crises. And then the Penryn campus is interdisciplinary by nature in a way, because my office is next door to the ESI, the Environment and Sustainability Institute, and in the same building as ecologists and bioscience colleagues. So it's structured in a way that makes it easier to do interdisciplinary work. And then in Penryn, we have business and environment, which I believe is a gem of a program. I'm biased, of course, but business and environment really is at the forefront of sustainability. This is an undergraduate program which was co-created between business and geography, but it has strong collaborations with bioscience, law, and politics as well. So we teach modules that are unique in the university. We have environment, society, and business in year one, ecological economics in the second year, and biomimicry in the final year. And students on the course experience learning with nature as well. So the so-called experiential and outdoor learning. So on the teaching side, I've been designing this program, and I deliver a first year module and work as a program director. So on the research side, being in this interdisciplinary context, I've recently become very interested in social ecological systems research, and particularly the work on transformation by resilient scholars like Per Olson or Carl Falk, Michelle Lee Moore, Brian Walker, and others. So I've been wrestling with questions such as, what does transformation actually mean, especially in the context of management education? Transformation has become a buzzword in a way, but what does it mean to transform management education? And what can management studies and management education learn from social ecological system research? So these are the questions I've been researching over the past few months. And going forward, I would like to continue working on building a bridge between management and organization studies and ecology. A bridge between ecology and economics, in a way, has already been built. So since the 1970s, there has been a lot of work on ecological economics. But I feel that a lot more work needs to be done to connect management and organization studies with the natural sciences. And a lot of the time, I think we have imposed our assumptions. So you hear ecologists talk about ecosystem service valuation or the environment as a missing market. But rarely we respectfully listen and learn from the way natural systems work. So what can we learn from concepts such as transformation, emergence, resilience, scale? There is a lot of work that needs to be done, I think, to ecologize management, perhaps, rather than manage ecological systems.
That's really interesting. I know from my own experience on the master's program, Sustainable Business Management, but then on the environment pathway, I've had the opportunity to engage with programs from geography, from law, and then next term I'm doing some with the medical school, and just getting the opportunity to sit in a classroom with people from lots and lots of different backgrounds. And it makes you more aware of the fact that the assumptions we make about topics based on our own previous experience. I mean, I was with the business school for my undergraduate studies. And then when you bring that into a discussion with someone from a different discipline, you realize, oh, actually, I made an assumption about what this topic actually means. And then from your perspective, it's entirely different when we start thinking about ecosystem services or talking about natural capital. I think, it's so important to start to have these conversations. Yeah, so very interesting to hear more about that. So I guess, can you tell us more about the notion of transformation that you just mentioned? I know that you recently published an article titled Transforming Management Education. So what have you learned from exploring social ecological systems research?
Well, one thing that I've learned from this field is that there is a critical difference between adaptation and transformation. Because adaptation is about stability. So it's about perpetuating the status quo. So adjusting responses to stay on the same trajectory. Whereas transformation, on the other hand, means crossing thresholds or reaching tipping points. So creating fundamental systemic change. So I think the important question that we need to ask ourselves is, are we simply looking to adapt business education to a changing climate, say, for example, or are we looking to transform it? And there's no doubt that there's now a growing focus in business schools on issues of sustainability, the Sustainable Development Goals, the planetary boundaries, responsible management education. And these are very important steps forward and topics that weren't really present when I was a student. So absolutely very important steps forward. However, I think that sometimes, and again, mostly unintentionally, but these initiatives can act as adaptive measures. So they are like a vent valve in a pressure cooker. You know how a pressure cooker works. It lets off steam to keep the system stable. So in a way, they feed balancing feedback loops. And that's why I think it's essential to stay critical. So how can we ensure that these efforts don't just maintain the status quo, but instead build momentum for transformation in business schools? And I believe that this requires questioning and redefining the foundational assumptions that underpin our discipline, as we discussed earlier. In other words, I think that we need to dig deep and uncover and challenge the assumptions that have historically guided business education and that in a way have contributed to creating the social and ecological crisis that we experience today. So what this means is that tweaking curricula or adding new sustainability courses isn't going to cut it, because transformation is about questioning the very foundation of what we do. So it's about asking, what are business schools for? Who are they for? Why do we learn? Why do we teach? To what end? For what future?
I guess thinking from a very personal level, as someone who's enrolled on a business program, how can we really be teaching these skills of critical thinking and questioning our assumptions? I mean, not only transforming curriculum, but also the ways that we think about things when we enter the business school and the conversations that we have.
Well, there are many transformation pathways. And this is interesting, to consider a social ecological system lens on the one hand, but to combine it with social innovation lens, which is one that I'm more familiar with. So when I try to do that, I've been able to highlight at least 5 transformation trajectories or scaling strategies in the language of social innovation. And the first one is what social innovation calls scaling deep, which is action-oriented towards transforming cultural roots. So this is a pathway that focuses on shifting the deep values and assumptions that underpin systems. You might have heard of Donella Meadows, who was a very inspiring environmental scientist, educator, and writer. And she sees this as the highest leverage point for system transformation. So a very powerful route for systems change. And this is also something that is widely recognized by other resilience scholars. But, then the question is, so how can we do this in practice? So how can this be implemented in practice? And I think this is about putting critical thinking at the heart of education. And also specifically in our field, integrating the so-called threshold concepts into management education. I'll give you a very simple example. So this is an exercise that I do every year with the students on the business and environment course. So I ask them to close their eyes and think about environment, society, and business as if they were 3 circles. And then I ask them to visualize the relationship between these 3 circles. So how would they combine them? And usually the majority of them draws a Venn diagram, 3 circles that partially overlap in the middle, but are otherwise separate. And this is the most common approach to sustainability, or the so-called weak approach to sustainability. But then we problematize that. So what if we considered environment, society, and business as nested circles? So with business embedded in social systems, which in turn are embedded in natural systems. So with no environment, there is no society. And with no society, there is no business, right? And so we talk about the concept of limit, the planetary boundaries, the social foundation. But this discussion is one they really remember that really helps in enabling a shift in mindset. Another transformation pathway that I think is very interesting is what social innovation scholars call scaling down, which is effectively action-oriented towards transforming power relations. So this is about refocusing or resetting our lives on a slower pace and prioritizing human well-being and ecological flourishing. And so strengthening relation with our communities, with the natural environment. And this perhaps sounds complex, but is related to very simple, concrete actions. So for example, you might have heard about the idea of reducing working hours. And this is something that the growth scholars have advocated for a long time. So a 4 days week. And they argue that this can help liberate time and energy for community engagement and non-market activities. And I think that to understand that, it's relevant to recall Hannah Arendt's distinction between labor, work, and action. So according to Hannah Arendt, an active life is made of all these 3 articulations. So labor, which has to do with production, work, which is a more creative, sort of, she calls it the process of fabrication, and then action, which is more related to political engagement. So scaling down doesn't mean reducing activity altogether, but downsizing the overpowering role of labor, so of production, to make space for work and action, so for fabrication and political engagement. And I think that in academia, a labor-obsessed life takes the form of, say, academics who occupy senior, tenured, or in other ways privileged positions, chasing even higher salaries or age indexes or awards and so on. So scaling down would mean encouraging all faculty to focus their energy on flourishing in place, say, rather than climbing ladders. And so engaging more in activities that enable ecological and human flourishing, both in the workplace and elsewhere. So let me move a bit faster because I have 3 more scaling strategies or transformation pathways that I think it's important to mention. The third one is the so-called scaling with. So it's action-oriented towards transforming relationships. And this pathway highlights the importance of building networks and partnerships. So when we deal with complex issues such as climate emergency or such as the transformation of management education, we need to work collaboratively, right, with other people. And so let me share a couple of concrete examples. In Penryn, you might have heard of the Ecological Citizen Network, which is an initiative that is co-created and co-led by students, staff, and the local community in response to the ecological crisis. Whereas in the context of management education, I'm a co-founding member of the MEN collective, and MEN stands for Management Educators Navigating Degrowth. And this is a group of early career researchers that support each other in developing alternative teaching practices focused on degrowth and post-growth. The fourth transformation trajectory or scaling strategy is called scaling out and has to do with expanding the reach of ideas and practices. So this involves spreading transformative practices to more people. So for example, MEN has been supporting a group of catalysts in setting up their own collectives. Or you might have heard of regenerative farmers providing training to new generations of farmers, where they effectively give away their knowledge and skills so that more people can engage in their own way in regenerative agriculture. So this is a transformation pathway that has to do with collegiality and with gratuity. And then finally, scaling up, which has to do with changing policies and regulations. So this involves institutionalizing change through policy shifts. And I think a powerful example of this is the action undertaken by students and staff at the University of Barcelona in 2022. So at the time, following a dismissive speech on climate change by the president of the Madrid Autonomous Region, Isabel Díaz Ayuso, students occupied the university for 7 days until the institution released an official statement, on the one hand, to express its full commitment to tackle the climate emergency, and also announcing that from 2024, all students at the university will have to take a 5-credit mandatory module on climate change. So in this case, students and staff pursue transformation through changing universities' regulations.
These are some really beautiful examples, actually, of the way that if you think outside of the box and beyond the traditional kind of perception that we have of what scaling actually involves. I mean, I loved exploring your academic papers on this when I was researching into community-supported agriculture programs and thinking about different ways of overcoming the challenges they face in terms of scaling and trying to be more resilient. So yeah, really interesting. And I definitely recommend the audience check out those papers. We'll definitely leave them in the show notes for afterwards. So I guess this makes me think about, is there hope for business schools to undergo the transformations necessary to become more civic and be able to meaningfully address challenges like climate change and biodiversity loss?
Well, I think business schools have played a big role in worsening the current social and ecological crisis historically. And they've done that through teaching narrow, mechanistic approaches to business and economics and fostering a culture of greed. But that said, I think that right now, business schools also have an essential role to play in addressing the historic challenges that we face today. And obviously, there are some significant barriers to transformation. For example, in this country, I think it's deeply problematic that tuition fees are so high. I would have never been able to afford university had I been born here. And I was in Copenhagen a few weeks ago. I was invited to give a talk at the Copenhagen Business School. And then not only tuition is free, but students are given grants to pay for things like food and housing. So anyway, there are some structural barriers, some of which are inescapable, but agency also matters. So both individual and collective action play a crucial role. And sometimes I think, who is the business school? We inhabit these institutions, whether we've chosen to be here or simply ended up here, this is where we are. So if we have hope, then there is hope. But if we don't, then there isn't going to be any. A few weeks ago, I had an interesting, quite scary conversation with some of the business and environment students. We were talking about civic management education, transformation, and one student at one point raised his hand and said, so this was a group of first-year undergraduate students. So he said, well, this is all very well, but I think that most of the people in the room don't think there's any hope left. So that we've gone too far, that we've crossed planetary boundaries beyond repair. So I asked them to raise their hands if they felt that way. And more than half the class did. So this to me is deeply concerning, right? Because having no hope in itself is a self-fulfilling prophecy. So if we assume that there is no hope, then for sure there is no hope. And when talking about hope, I think about the Italian philosopher who said, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. So if we look at the latest Living Planet report or the latest IPCC report, well, then there is no reason to be hopeful. And yet we must be, because that's the only way we can make change happen. So in a way, hope is the spark that keeps the flame alive, right? Is the foundation for action, for resistance, for transformation. And to end on a hopeful note, I think perhaps is worth highlighting. I think it's one direction for positive change in business schools, which is also something that we have been practicing here in Penryn. And that is the growing interest in embodied learning and outdoor education. So this idea of learning with nature. I think this is something that more and more educators are willing to experiment with. And I think that these are pedagogical tools that have real transformative potential because they offer a way to overcome this idea of this human nature duality, and they help us reconnect both with society and the natural world and engage in learning that is more human in a way, that is cognitive but is also experiential, it's embodied. And every time I take the students out, I can see them regaining hope. So it's when they speak to the farmers, for example, or when they see the effects the regenerative agriculture has on the land, on wildlife, or on the food that we eat. So it's when they touch the soil, when they smell fresh basil, or when they get their hands dirty. So that's when you can see hope resurfacing. So I think hope comes from experiencing the social ecological systems in which our schools are set. And this is definitely something that we should engage with more.
So that brings me to my very last question. Reflecting on today's conversation, what would be your call to action?
Well, first of all, I think it's important that policymakers reconsider what is the purpose of higher education in general and management education in particular. So is it just about giving students the knowledge and skill they need to get jobs in a competitive market? Or does it also aim to cultivate knowledge, critical thinking, and to serve broader social ecological interests? I think higher education should be reframed as a public and common good rather than privilege or a return on investment, right? A private good. And secondly, it's important to strengthen interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity as we discussed today. So how can we work together? This is necessary for addressing complex challenges, what are called wicked problems, such as the climate emergency, biodiversity loss, social inequality. And this work is difficult, it's time-consuming. It requires a lot of translation, a lot of unlearning and relearning. And universities need to recognize the value of this work and support it. And thirdly, I think that we must pay attention to our curricula. So traditionally in a business school, students learn that management is about achieving greater efficiency of performance, that business is about maximizing profit, that economics is about GDP growth. But to what extent do students learn about sufficiency or social entrepreneurship or well-being approaches to economics? To what extent do they explore a plurality of perspectives and consider the needs of multiple stakeholders? And to what extent do they learn about the social foundations of business and its planetary boundaries? And I also think that we need to make more efforts to decolonize the management curriculum. So to bring different philosophical approaches into the classroom and to observe through the lenses of knowledge systems that are different from Western rationalism. Because this can really help us overcome the conceptual separation between humans and nature, and can help us acknowledge that are part of nature, that environment, society, and business are interdependent. And finally, as we discussed earlier, I think it's fundamental to explore different pedagogies. So utilizing different pedagogical tools, so experiential learning, outdoor education, embodied approaches. And in relation to this, I think ultimately a call to action would be to get outside and start by paying attention, perhaps. So what can you see? What can you not see? What can you hear? What can you not hear? So why do we have a moorland with no trees? Or why do we have, in the words of Rachel Carson, silent springs? So this is something that we discussed with the students recently. So it's always important to question what is taken for granted, I think, and focus on what we can do. Remembering that transformation is a collective effort, so it's not something that any one person can achieve alone. So overall, I think that it's important to balance, on the one hand, the courage, perhaps, to drive transformative action, but also, on the other hand, the humility to recognize the limits of what we can do, of human agency, but without letting the magnitude of the issues we are confronted with make us lose hope. So the key is to start somewhere, right? Perhaps from something small, but then look out for other small action, and then we can see that many small actions actually make a difference.
Thank you so much, Laura. This really does lead us to have a lot of inward reflection, but also remember to get outside and to maybe take a walk barefoot and feel the ground beneath our feet, and remember that in actual fact that sometimes small is beautiful, and little tiny actions every single day, and shared experiences in our communities. I mean, in Cornwall, we're so lucky. There's so many different things going on, and so many opportunities to get involved and feel like you're having a positive impact that's bigger than yourself, but not too big that it feels overwhelming. And I'd say to all the other students who are listening to this podcast to look out for ways to get involved in the local community. I mean, for me, as a student who moved to Cornwall during the lockdown, COVID was in my first year of university, and it was definitely a very, very isolating time, and a time to definitely feel feelings of climate anxiety and concern about the future and what my place was in it and what impact I could have. But it was through getting outside and getting involved with projects and making friends and building community that I was able to start to put these concerns into action and feel like I was able to achieve something. So that's what I would say to the audience today. But thank you so much, Laura. This has been really lovely and really interesting. I feel like there are so many different areas we've covered, and I've definitely learned lots of new things. So I hope the audience has enjoyed this today. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And what a wonderful way to finish. I think you are giving some really good advice there. So yeah, thanks again. It's been a pleasure to be part of this podcast.